The Russian war machine is falling apart, and that's confirmed by a former Navy SEAL. Soviet tanks over 50 years old being sent back to the front. Experienced officers wiped out on the battlefield. And a country more isolated than ever, trying to sustain a war that's dragged on for more than 3.5 years. Sanctions are choking its industry, while Vladimir Putin's regime faces internal strain not seen since the collapse of the Soviet Union. On the other side, Ukraine keeps resisting. And in today's episode, we're digging into the data and analysis behind the collapse of Russia's war machine. To break it down, I brought a special guest, Chris Turner, former U.S. Navy SEAL. With decades of military experience, he brings a raw, detailed, no BS take on what's at stake in the most dangerous war of the century. So welcome to another episode of The Front, where you'll see exactly how Russia is falling apart. Chris, it's been more than 3 years since Russia first invaded Ukraine. It's crazy how much time has passed, and we're still here talking about a war that most people thought would last a few weeks, maybe a couple of months at most. What's your read on the situation today, especially compared to those chaotic first days back in February 2022?
Man, it's surreal. What we're seeing now is nothing like what any of us expected when this kicked off. When I saw those first images of Russian armor rolling toward Kiev, I figured it would be a repeat of Georgia or Crimea, fast, brutal, and decisive. But here we are, 3.5 years later, in a totally unexpected stalemate. What we've got now is basically a front line that shifts inch by inch. The Russians are still trying to push in Donetsk and Luhansk, but it's nothing like that blitzkrieg they tried at the start. This has turned into a war of attrition, where every square foot of ground costs hundreds of lives.
And it's wild how that totally changed the nature of the conflict, right? At the beginning, we were watching these massive tank columns trying to surround entire cities. Now it looks more like World War I, except with drones and high-tech gear.
Exactly, and that shows how Ukraine completely flipped the game. They turned what was supposed to be a quick Russian win into a modern trench war. And look, that didn't just happen by accident. The Ukrainians adapted brilliantly, using terrain they know better than anyone, mixing old-school guerrilla tactics with cutting-edge tech. I saw reports recently that Russia is still gaining ground, but at what cost? In late August 2025, they managed to take about 76 square miles, that's 3 times the size of Martha's Vineyard, but they lost thousands of troops doing it. That kind of advance just isn't sustainable long-term.
Speaking of that, one thing that really caught attention lately was this so-called spiderweb operation the Ukrainians pulled off in June. Can you explain to people who don't follow closely what that was and why it mattered so much?
The spiderweb operation was one of those moves that proves the Ukrainians are playing chess while the Russians are playing checkers. On June 1st, they managed to sneak drones into air bases deep inside Russian territory. I'm not talking about the border areas, I mean way inside. The result was devastating: 41 high-value aircraft damaged or destroyed, including strategic bombers. Those things cost tens of millions each and take years to replace. But even more important than the money is the strategic hit. Those bombers were being used to coordinate strikes inside Ukraine.
That must have hit them hard psychologically too, right? Losing gear on the front line is one thing, but having your own bases attacked is something else.
Totally. Imagine you're a Russian pilot and you find out bases you thought were untouchable can get hit anytime. That changes everything: your sense of safety, your morale. And it wasn't a one-off. All through June and July, the Ukrainians kept up these precision strikes inside Russia. They shot down Su-35s, hit Su-34s, always with that surgical accuracy that defines their ops now.
But let's be real here, Chris. As impressive as these Ukrainian operations are, Russia still has massive resources. Do they still pose a real threat, or are we at the point where their offensive capability is basically shot?
From what I'm seeing, Russia's lost the ability to launch big offensive operations like they tried in the beginning. That's the million-dollar question, isn't it? I'll be straight with you, this is my personal take after decades of studying military operations. The numbers are brutal. We're talking over 790,000 Russian casualties, dead and wounded, based on NATO's latest estimates. To put that in perspective, that's more than 10 times what the Soviets lost during the entire Afghanistan occupation. But here's the thing: even wounded, Russia still has plenty of destructive capacity. It's like a wounded animal, it might not be able to hunt like before, but if you corner it, it's still incredibly dangerous.
And what about Ukraine? We always hear about Russian losses, but obviously the Ukrainians are paying a heavy price too. How do you see their ability to hold out long term?
The key difference is that Ukraine's fighting at home for their kids, their land, their existence as a nation. That gives you a kind of motivation you just can't fake. Of course, they're suffering too. Zelensky admitted that by January this year, Ukrainian casualties had reached 400,000 dead and wounded. Those are devastating numbers for any country. But what impresses me is how they've kept their command structure intact and built an efficient troop rotation system. And there's another huge factor: Western support. Since 2022, Ukraine's received over $407 billion in aid, with more than $118 billion coming just from the US. That's not just cash, it's training, intel, modern equipment. That's what lets them not only hold the line, but also innovate tactically.
So when you look at the big picture, Chris, what's your take? Are we moving towards some kind of resolution, or is this just going to drag on as a war of attrition for years?
Sadly, I think what we're seeing is what military strategists call an unstable equilibrium. Neither side has the power to win decisively, but neither is willing to give in, because giving in means losing way more than just territory. It's about sovereignty, national pride, geopolitical credibility. What worries me is that this kind of conflict can drag on indefinitely, bleeding both sides dry. History's full of wars that started as short operations and turned into endless bloodletting. And the longer it goes, the higher the risk of an accidental escalation or even direct involvement by other powers.
Chris, let's talk about something that really hits hard when you stop to look at the numbers: Russia's military losses. We're talking about a scale that's honestly hard to even grasp. Can you give us a real sense of what that means?
The numbers are mind-blowing. And look, I've seen a lot of conflicts in my career, but what's happening to the Russian forces has no precedent in modern military history. According to the U.S. Defense Intelligence Agency, since the start of this operation, Russia has lost at least 10,000 ground combat vehicles. That includes more than 3,000 main battle tanks. That's more tanks than most countries even have in their entire arsenals. And the numbers keep climbing. The latest Ukrainian data says over 11,000 tanks destroyed. Even if you assume some exaggeration, we're still talking about losses that took decades to build up.
But tanks can be replaced, right? What really worries me are the human losses. How is that hitting the structure of Russia's armed forces?
That's the real critical point. You can manufacture equipment, even if it takes time and money, but combat experience, veteran leadership, unit cohesion, you can't manufacture that in a factory. The most conservative estimates say Russia's closing in on 1 million casualties. That includes dead, wounded, missing, and deserters. To put that in perspective, it's like Russia losing the entire population of San Jose, California. But what's even more devastating is the loss of experienced officers. Battalion commanders, colonels, even generals have been dying in alarming numbers. That happens because Russian military doctrine requires officers to be close to the front lines to coordinate operations. With GPS-guided artillery and precision drones, that's basically a death sentence.
And how does that show up in the quality of their operations today?
It's a downward spiral that feeds on itself. When you lose experienced officers, you promote people who aren't ready. That leads to poorly coordinated operations, which cause even more losses, which trigger even more premature promotions. It's a vicious cycle. I've seen intel reports describing Russian units being led by lieutenants who should be commanding platoons, but instead they're trying to run entire battalions. Imagine a computer tech trying to conduct a symphony orchestra. It might make noise, but it won't be music.
And here's something that always puzzles me. How is Russia even replacing its equipment? Because we've seen footage of T-62 tanks being sent to the front. Those things are from the 1960s.
That's exactly what shows the depth of the crisis. The T-62s are tanks my dad could have faced in Vietnam. They're pulling this gear out of storage where it's been rusting out in the open for decades. According to Ukrainian intelligence, the problem isn't just the lack of modern gear. It's the industrial inability to produce new, complex systems because they can't get imported high-tech components. Sanctions are hitting in a way that maybe wasn't obvious at first, but is now crystal clear. So what Russia's doing is basically cannibalizing its Cold War stockpile. It's like trying to race in Formula One with a car from the 60s. It might move, but it's not winning anything.
That's gotta crush morale too, right? Because it's one thing going into battle knowing you've got top gear, but a whole different story when you know you're rolling in refurbished junk.
Absolutely. And it's not just the outdated equipment. The whole support system is crumbling. Soldiers killed in action are being listed as deserters just so the state doesn't have to pay their families. Imagine you're a Russian soldier, and you know that if you die fighting in what your government calls a special operation, your family might not see a single dime because officially you were marked as a deserter. That destroys any sense of loyalty or purpose.
So when you put all that together, massive human losses, outdated equipment, morale in free fall, how do you rate Russia's ability to keep this war going?
Militarily speaking, Russia's operating with just a fraction of the capacity it had in early 2022. They've lost not only equipment and manpower, but something far more precious, the reputation of their armed forces. For decades, the world respected and feared Russian military power. Today, everyone can see the emperor has no clothes. And that has consequences far beyond Ukraine. Countries that once would have been intimidated by Russian threats now know it's more bark than bite. The question isn't whether Russia can keep the war going. They've still got resources and can keep throwing poorly equipped men into the grinder. The question is how long Putin can keep selling that story at home, because reality is getting harder and harder to hide.
Chris, let's move to something that might be even more decisive for the future of this conflict, Russia's economic situation. Because one thing is battlefield losses, but keeping up a war economy for over 3 years under the toughest sanctions in modern history is something else.
That's the heart of it. A military campaign is like a Formula One race. It doesn't matter how good your driver is if you run out of fuel halfway through. And Russia's burning through its resources at an insane pace. The country's under the biggest sanctions package ever applied in history. More than 20,000 individual sanctions imposed by 50 different countries. To give you a sense of scale, that's more sanctions than Iran, North Korea, and Syria combined over decades.
And how does that play out on the ground for the Russian economy? Because from the outside, it sometimes looks like they're finding ways around it.
That's a dangerous illusion. Russia's become a full-on war economy. They're pouring every available resource into military production, cutting back on healthcare, education, civilian infrastructure. It's like burning your furniture to keep the fireplace going. It works short-term, but eventually you run out of furniture. The bigger problem is tech isolation. Sanctions cut Russia off from advanced microchips, electronics, specialized software. That doesn't just hit military production, it cripples the entire country's ability to modernize. There are reports of Russian factories trying to keep running by using fridge and washing machine parts as substitutes for sophisticated military components. It's like trying to do heart surgery with kitchen tools, technically possible, but the results are disastrous.
And that must be hitting civilians directly too, right? Because a war economy means someone's footing the bill, and it's usually not the guys in power.
Exactly. Inflation skyrocketed, basic goods have disappeared from shelves, businesses have shut down because they can't get parts or capital. The government tries to massage the numbers, but you can't hide it when people can't find what they need at the store. There's also a huge psychological factor. For decades, Russians got used to Western products, modern tech, global connections. Suddenly they're cut off, stuck with outdated gear, no access to services they once took for granted. That builds social pressure quietly. People may not protest openly out of fear, but the discontent is growing like a pressure cooker.
But let's be realistic here. Russia's a country with massive natural resources. Can't they just lean on oil and gas exports to keep going indefinitely?
Fair question, but reality's trickier. Sure, Russia's still selling energy, mostly to China and India, but at huge discounts. They're moving oil for way below global market prices because they've only got a handful of buyers and shipping costs are way higher. On top of that, Russia's energy infrastructure is aging fast. Without Western tech for maintenance and upgrades, oil fields and pipelines are running less efficiently. It's like driving a car without ever servicing it. It runs for a while, but eventually it breaks down. And here's something people forget, brains are leaving Russia. Engineers, programmers, scientists, a whole generation of talent is getting out. You can't build a modern economy without qualified human capital.
So in your view, What's the realistic timeline before these economic pressures start seriously crippling Russia's ability to sustain the war?
Based on what I'm seeing, and this is my personal take, we're talking a relatively short window. Russia's got big reserves, but they're not endless, and they're burning through them at an unsustainable pace. The real breaking point isn't when the money runs out, it's when the industrial capacity totally collapses. Without modern components, without skilled people, without infrastructure investment, Russia's economy is just running on leftovers from past decades. History shows authoritarian regimes can drag out costly wars for surprisingly long, but there's always a limit. The Soviet Union looked unstoppable right up until the day it couldn't sustain its military commitments anymore and collapsed in a matter of months.
And that has consequences way beyond Ukraine, right?
Absolutely. We might be watching the end of Russia as a global military power. That completely reshapes the world balance. China gets more isolated in its rivalry with the West, countries in the old Soviet sphere have to rethink their defense strategies, and the entire global security system needs a reset. This is one of those historic turning points where future generations will look back and say, that's when everything changed. And we're living through it in real time, not knowing exactly how it ends, but knowing that when it does, the world won't be the same.
Chris, when we look at this conflict, one thing that really stands out is how Russia has managed to reinvent itself militarily, even while facing so many limitations. Would you say there's genuine creativity in this adaptive process?
Look, it's fascinating to see this coming from a traditionally rigid military structure. What we're watching is pure necessity turning into innovation. Russia is literally resurrecting Soviet-era tanks. We're talking about machines decades old being brought back to life with improvised armor plates welded on the sides, basic electronics borrowed from civilian gear. It's like watching a military history museum come alive on the battlefield. And maintaining this old equipment has forced the Russians to develop logistical solutions that border on genius. Mobile repair shops right on the front lines, parts scavenged from damaged vehicles to keep others running. It's survival engineering in its rawest form.
And this goes way beyond tanks, right? We've seen creative adaptations of weapons that weren't even designed for this type of warfare.
Exactly. They've turned unguided aerial bombs, which are basically just chunks of metal packed with explosives, into precision weapons by strapping on improvised guidance kits. Missiles from decades ago are being reprogrammed with commercial GPS systems pulled from civilian smartphones and tablets. There are confirmed reports of drones being rigged to carry explosives salvaged from damaged artillery shells. Now, it's important to be clear, this info comes from Western intelligence reports and battlefield analysis, so there's always some uncertainty about the exact extent of these adaptations. But the pattern is obvious, we're watching an army learning to improvise with limited resources. All of this is pretty crude compared to modern weapons systems, but it's had a significant impact, especially on civilian areas and Ukrainian fixed positions. That ability to turn limited tech into effective tools of destruction is, paradoxically, both a symptom of scarcity and a sign of ingenuity under extreme pressure.
But when we talk about FPV drones, it looks like Russia actually made a real qualitative leap, right?
Absolutely. FPV drones evolved dramatically. We started with 7-inch drones in 2022, and by 2024 and 2025, they'd grown into 13-inch models being deployed. These little machines have become some of the deadliest weapons in this war. They're cheap to make, hard for conventional defenses to detect, and can hit everything from armored vehicles to artillery positions and infantry. Russia started off slow in this drone race, but it's ramped up exponentially with critical help from Iran and North Korea. Those countries aren't just supplying ready-made equipment, they're also providing components and the know-how for local production. The Russians set up drone production centers in inland cities, out of Western Intel's reach, using commercial parts funneled in through complex smuggling networks. What blows me away is the speed of this evolution. We've never seen drones used at this scale in any war before. A whole new style of combat is being created in real time.
These partnerships with countries like Iran and North Korea show Moscow's willing to team up with anyone to keep its war machine running.
Exactly. When you're isolated by the West, you take your options where you can. Iran already had deep expertise in tactical drones. They'd been working on this tech for years as a way to project power without direct confrontation. Russia just took that knowledge, adapted it to its own needs, and started mass-scaling production. According to Putin himself in February 2024, Russia's military-industrial complex created 520,000 new jobs since the invasion began and now employs 3.5 million workers. Now, we should always take official Russian stats with skepticism, but even so, it points to a serious mobilization effort. But these alliances go way beyond just the technical side. They're building a mutual support axis between authoritarian regimes, directly positioning themselves against the West. That's geopolitics in action.
And even if these solutions are technically inferior to Western systems, they're still prolonging the war indefinitely.
No doubt. These measures don't give Russia military superiority, but they stop a total collapse of its capabilities. It shows Russia has learned to fight effectively with what it's got. It's not elegant, it's not clean, but it works. And in a drawn-out war like this, working can buy you months or even years of extra resistance. It's basically a war of attrition where creativity itself has become a survival weapon. The real question is, how long can this adaptive capacity make up for Russia's structural weaknesses?
Chris, now I want to dig into the devastating human side of this war. Russia is literally losing an entire generation. What does that mean demographically for the country?
It's absolutely devastating, and the numbers are staggering. By summer 2025, Russia will probably hit 1 million casualties, a grim, shocking milestone. We're talking hundreds of thousands of young Russians between 18 and 35 who've just disappeared from society, either killed in combat or fleeing the country to avoid the draft. Over 300,000 Russian citizens and residents left the country by mid-March 2022, at least 500,000 by late August, and another 400,000 by early October. And those are just the numbers we can track. The real figure may be even worse. Many of the very people who should be building Russia's future are either buried in Ukrainian fields or living abroad as political exiles. That has direct, measurable effects on birth rates, family structures, even basic social cohesion.
And that ties directly into a critical economic problem, the shortage of skilled labor.
Exactly. Engineers, skilled technicians, programmers, healthcare professionals, many have been drafted to the front or simply left the country. The population is shrinking, and its composition has shifted dramatically. Young, educated men are leaving. Universities lost promising students, companies lost rising leaders. Add that to the natural aging of the population, which was already a serious problem before the war, and the picture gets even bleaker. By 2100, Russia's population is projected to shrink to a median of 126 million, a massive drop from today's roughly 145 million. The country ends up running on a smaller, older, less skilled workforce. And demographic damage like this doesn't heal in a few years, it takes decades.
That creates a vicious cycle that's almost impossible to break. The more qualified people leave, the slower recovery becomes.
Exactly. Russia might be able to physically rebuild infrastructure, but without skilled people, it's slower and structurally weaker. With more young men drafted into the army, the labor market a decade from now will look very different, and that shifts the entire trajectory of the Russian economy. In the medium and long term, this directly impacts innovation capacity, overall productivity, and even basic social cohesion. A whole generation scarred by fear, grief, and absence won't easily become optimistic and productive. That kind of damage can even shape the country's political stability down the road.
Do you think the Kremlin is fully aware of this demographic impact? Or do they just accept it as an operational cost?
In my view, and I'm speculating here, based on historic patterns, I think they know, but they're only playing the short game. The priority is survival right now, keeping the regime afloat, preventing immediate collapse. But the long-term cost is enormous. What really worries me is that this demographic hit may be one of the hardest things to reverse, even after the war eventually ends. And that's not even counting the collective psychological trauma, returning soldiers, grieving families, whole communities scarred.
And naturally, that shapes how the country even sees its own future.
Exactly. How do you build a hopeful future when your present is all fear, repression, and collective grief? This goes far beyond economics. It's a deep, collective wound that could define a generation, marked by resentment, distrust of institutions, and widespread hopelessness. And scars like that don't magically vanish with peace deals or reconstruction programs. They linger for decades.
Chris, given all this context, what can we say about the emotional state of the Russian population today? Is there even such a thing as collective morale left?
It's a fractured morale, split into layers. You've got part of the population that genuinely buys into the Kremlin's official line, fueled by non-stop propaganda on state TV and controlled social media. But then you've got another big segment, especially in big cities like Moscow and St. Petersburg, living in a constant state of fear and quiet frustration. Russian forces have advanced an average of only 50 meters a day in areas like Kharkiv, slower than the Somme offensive in World War I. When you've got family at the front facing that kind of brutal reality, it's hard to keep believing in this successful special operation narrative. Desertions are way up, conscription is sparking more and more resistance, and the social silence says more than any public protest could. It's the silence of people too afraid to speak.
And that fear itself becomes a powerful political tool for the government, right? It basically paralyzes society.
Totally. Fear is one of the most effective political weapons out there, and the Kremlin is a master at using it. They keep control not just through direct policing, but by controlling information and keeping people in a constant state of uncertainty. When people are afraid to speak openly, act politically, or even think critically about the regime, you've got a society in social hibernation. That absolutely helps maintain power short-term, but it kills any chance for healthy renewal or adaptation.
And yet state propaganda still keeps trying to project an image of national strength and popular legitimacy.
Yep, and we've got to recognize that message still resonates with many, especially in rural areas far from the big cosmopolitan centers. In those places, state TV is often the only source of info, and it constantly frames the war as a heroic defense of the motherland against Western aggression. But that narrative collapses when it hits reality. When coffins start coming home, when basic goods skyrocket in price, when sons don't come back from this special operation, that's when the cracks in the official story show.
So even though outwardly it looks stable, inside there's building tension and exhaustion.
No question. Modern Russia is basically an emotional powder keg. The people are visibly tired, forced into silence, but not necessarily resigned. There's a very real, very heavy tension under the surface. History shows authoritarian regimes often collapse from the inside, and usually in ways that surprise outside observers. The real question is, how long can that psychological and social pressure be contained by repression?
And historically, that kind of internal breakdown can be just as dangerous to a regime as any outside military threat.
Exactly. Wars aren't won solely on the battlefield. If the civilian morale collapses, the regime loses its base of support. And in Russia's case, with so much pressure at once, sanctions and isolation from the outside, human and economic costs piling up inside, that balance of stability gets shakier and harder to predict. What we're watching is a stress test between the regime's ability to control through fear and propaganda versus the population's ability to endure ever-growing costs. And those kinds of tests rarely end in predictable ways.
Chris, after talking about Russia's situation, we need to look at the other side of this story. Where does Ukraine stand today, after almost 3 years of intense conflict?
Man, it's a situation that blends heroism and exhaustion in a way I've never seen in decades of military analysis. Let's look at the latest verified numbers. According to President Zelensky himself in January 2025, Ukraine has lost about 43,000 soldiers in combat. Now, that number might seem low compared to the estimated 700,000 plus Russian casualties, but for a country with Ukraine's population, it's devastating.
And when we talk about the wounded, the situation gets even more complex, right?
Exactly. We're talking hundreds of thousands wounded, many with life-altering injuries. What a lot of people don't realize is that every wounded soldier needs specialized medical care, rehab, and often can't return to combat. It's like taking the entire population of a city like Curitiba and saying, these people can't contribute the same way to national defense anymore. The impact goes way beyond the raw numbers.
And that's not even counting civilians, who are also constantly suffering.
Right, the UN data is staggering. By July 2025, more than 49,000 civilians had been reported killed or wounded. But let's be clear, those numbers are conservative. The UN only confirms cases it can directly verify. In cities like Mariupol, which were completely surrounded, there could have been thousands of deaths that will never make it into official statistics.
Chris, let's talk about equipment. The West sent a lot of gear, but what's the real story behind those donations?
That's both fascinating and concerning. Let's start with the famous German Leopard tanks. Germany pledged about 18 Leopard 2A6S, one of the most advanced tanks in the world. Each one costs around $15 million. But here's the problem: when one of those tanks gets hit by a Russian anti-tank missile, it's not like fixing a car at your neighborhood shop.
How so? What's the difference?
Imagine you own a Formula One Ferrari. If it breaks down mid-race, you need Ferrari-specific parts, Ferrari-trained mechanics, and specialized tools. Now multiply that by 1,000. The Leopard runs on German targeting systems, NATO-specific ammo, and spare parts that come straight from Germany. If a fire control component burns out, there's no way to improvise with Ukrainian parts.
And that leaves Ukraine fully dependent on the European supply chain.
Completely. And it's not just tanks. The US made HIMARS systems, which are essential for Ukraine's precision strikes, fire missiles that cost $400,000 each. Ukraine can't make those missiles, so every shot depends on US stockpiles. It's like fighting with borrowed weapons, knowing the ammo could run dry any time.
But Ukraine's creativity has been surprising, hasn't it?
Man, absolutely. They took $500 commercial drones and turned them into weapons that can blow up $3 million tanks. They built a kamikaze drone industry out of civilian market parts. Pure genius. But even with that, for large-scale operations, they still rely on heavy Western hardware.
Chris, let's get into a politically sensitive but crucial question. How long could Ukraine survive without Western support?
I'll be blunt: without NATO support, especially from the US, Ukraine would have collapsed in the first few months of 2022. No exaggeration. Let's look at the numbers. According to the Council on Foreign Relations, the US has approved $175 billion in aid to Ukraine since the start of the war. That's more than the GDP of a lot of countries.
But when you say approved, that doesn't mean it's all been delivered, right?
Exactly. In practice, much of that aid is still in the pipeline. For example, in 2024, US deliveries averaged about $500 million per month. For 2025, the projection was $920 million a month. But here's the key point: it all depends on political will in Washington.
And that's where changes in government among donor countries come into play.
Exactly. Take a real-world example: the 2024 US elections. Different parties have completely different views on continuing this level of support. Some Republicans argue the money should be spent on domestic US issues. On the Democratic side, there's stronger consensus for continued aid, but even there you see public fatigue.
And that's mirrored in Europe too.
Yep, and in interesting ways. Germany, which was hesitant at first, became the second largest donor. They completely shifted their post-World War II defense policy. But countries like Hungary and Slovakia have openly questioned ongoing support. Europe is divided.
What's the practical impact of that political uncertainty?
Imagine planning a military operation knowing your ammo supply could be cut halfway through. Ukraine has to think long-term strategy, but it's living on budgets approved 6 months at a time. It's like trying to drive while only looking 5 meters ahead.
And what about NATO stockpiles? Where do they stand?
Here's a stat most people don't know: NATO artillery ammo stocks are dangerously low. The Western defense industry was built for limited wars, not a high-intensity slugfest that's lasted 3 years. Ukraine fires more shells in a single week than many NATO countries stockpile for an entire year.
So this is forcing changes in Western defense production itself?
Totally. Companies like Rheinmetall, Lockheed Martin, and BAE Systems have had to restart production lines that were shut down decades ago. In my view, this war is rewriting the whole concept of Western defense production. They've realized you can't just have limited war capacity, you need to be ready for long, grinding conflicts.
Chris, after everything we've discussed, let's talk about something that affects both sides deeply. What does it actually mean to fight a war that's dragged on almost 3 years?
Man, that's the kind of question that keeps me up at night. Militarily, we call it a war of attrition. But when you look at the human data behind that label, it's brutal. More than 6 million Ukrainians have fled since 2022. To give you a sense of scale, that's like the entire population of the state of Rio de Janeiro being forced to leave their homes.
And those who stay behind face a reality that's nothing like life before 2022.
Exactly. Ukrainian kids growing up today don't know peace. They go to school to the sound of air raid sirens. Hospitals are running in basements. A whole generation is growing up under constant trauma. From my experience in war zones, I know those psychological scars take decades to heal if they ever do.
And on the practical side, how does infrastructure hold up under years of bombardment?
Here's a stat that sums it up. As of January 2025, Russia had damaged or destroyed more than 40% of Ukraine's energy infrastructure. That means millions of people spend winters with spotty heating, in temperatures that can drop to minus 20 degrees Celsius. It's literally a strategy to make civilian life impossible.
You mentioned that both sides are stuck in a who can outlast the other mindset. How does that work in practice?
It's both fascinating and terrifying. For Putin, retreat is impossible. It would mean admitting he sacrificed hundreds of thousands of soldiers for nothing. For Ukraine, giving up territory means accepting permanent loss of parts of their country. Neither side has a politically viable way to step back.
And that creates a situation where no one can find a way out?
What we're seeing is what analysts call a mutilating stalemate. Nobody can win decisively, but both keep bleeding. It's like two people locked in an arm wrestling match for hours. Eventually, one gives in, but both pay a massive physical and emotional price.
What's the impact on Ukrainian troop morale?
Here I have to be careful to separate fact from speculation. What we know for sure is that frontline Ukrainian units from 2022 are facing extreme combat fatigue. Soldiers under constant bombardment for months develop what we call operational exhaustion. It's not cowardice, it's a normal biological response to prolonged extreme stress.
And how does that show up on the battlefield?
Slower reaction times, trouble focusing, more tactical mistakes. That's why Ukraine's been trying to rotate troops more frequently. But with manpower shortages, many units stay on the line longer than is militarily ideal.
Is there any historical precedent for this kind of prolonged conflict?
The closest would be World War I, especially the Western Front trenches. Back then you had modern tech causing massive casualties, with front lines barely moving for months. The difference today is we've added precision missiles, drones, and cyber warfare, making it all even more complex.
In your opinion, Chris, is there a point where this resistance just reaches its limit?
Look, every war has breaking points, and they're not always military. They can be economic, when a side can't finance the fight anymore, political, when public support collapses, or social, when the fabric of society unravels. With Ukraine, what impresses me is how they've already survived moments when analysts, including myself, thought they were at their limit, and yet they found more reserves of resilience.
Does that have to do with the fact they're fighting on their own soil?
Absolutely. There's a huge psychological difference between invading and defending. Ukrainian soldiers know if they fall back, their families could be next. Russian soldiers, especially those shipped in from far-off regions like Siberia, are fighting for political goals that may feel abstract to them. That motivation gap shows up in combat effectiveness.
To wrap this section, Chris, what's your take on the cost of post-war reconstruction?
The numbers are astronomical. The World Bank estimated full reconstruction of Ukraine will cost over $400 billion. For context, that's nearly the size of Brazil's entire GDP. And that's just physical infrastructure. The human cost, the psychological trauma, the loss of intellectual capital from emigration, there's no price tag for that.
That's a bill future generations will be paying.
No doubt. And every day this war drags on, that bill grows. That's why, despite all the political complexity, finding a diplomatic solution isn't just desirable, it's urgent. Whatever the cost of peace, it's always lower than the cost of a war dragged out like this.
Chris, we've reached a crucial point in our conversation. With all the military, economic, and social strain we've discussed, how do you see Putin's government today? Are there real signs that internal pressure is building?
Look, this is one of the most fascinating things to watch right now in 2025. Pressure is coming from multiple directions at the same time, and that creates a very unstable environment. First, we need to understand that keeping up the image of absolute strength is essential for any authoritarian regime. It's like holding up a facade that can't show cracks. But those cracks are starting to appear. Russia's business elite, especially those hit hardest by sanctions, are showing growing dissatisfaction. Recently, we've seen reports that some of Russia's top bankers, including German Gref from Sberbank, have made statements directly contradicting the Kremlin's rosy economic narrative. That's something you just didn't see before this so-called special military operation.
That's interesting because normally those executives follow the official government line, right?
Exactly. And what's even more striking is that groups within the armed forces themselves have started questioning not only strategic decisions but the very conduct of the war. Remember, these are career military officers who've dedicated their lives to service. When those professionals start voicing doubts even quietly, it signals that the regime's support pillars are being questioned. The Russian economy is in what I'd call a dangerous overheating phase. Military spending hit 6% of GDP in 2025, the highest level since the Cold War. That means resources that should be going to infrastructure, education, and social welfare are being drained to fund military operations.
And that episode with the Wagner Group you mentioned earlier, was that really a turning point?
No doubt, it was historic. What happened with Yevgeny Prigozhin and Wagner in June 2023 proved something many analysts thought impossible. Even in such a tightly controlled regime, dissatisfaction can take an armed and direct form. It was a moment when the whole world saw that even the Kremlin's closest allies can turn against the system. Since then, there's been massive restructuring of military commands and much tighter control over private militias. But here's the key: you can control structures, but it's much harder to control the dissatisfaction that fueled that uprising. It's like trying to hold water in your hands, it always slips through somewhere.
A lot of people are comparing this moment to the last years of the Soviet Union. Do you see those historical parallels too?
I do, and honestly, it's unsettling. In the 1980s, the Soviet Union faced exactly what we're seeing now: growing international isolation, a costly, drawn-out war in Afghanistan, an economy under huge strain, and a population increasingly skeptical of official narratives. The big difference is that today, the control and surveillance apparatus is way more sophisticated. Cameras, monitored internet, algorithms tracking behavior. But even with all that tech, the Soviet system, which looked unshakable, collapsed relatively quickly between 1989 and 1991. History shows no regime is truly indestructible once it loses the trust of its own elites.
So you're saying that even with all the current repression, the system isn't unbreakable?
Exactly. And here's something I always remind my fellow analysts: authoritarian regimes often look rock solid right up until the moment they collapse. It's like a building with rotting foundations, it looks sturdy from the outside, but when it gives way, it happens fast. What props up the system today is a mix of fear and lack of clear alternatives. But if a new power center emerges, political or military, and gains both internal and external backing, the entire dynamic could change overnight. The danger lies in how unpredictable that kind of transition can be.
Now, let's flip the coin. Chris, how do you see the role Ukraine has taken on in the international arena? It feels like the country has become much more than just a nation fighting for its sovereignty.
You've hit the nail on the head. Ukraine has truly become a global icon of democratic resistance against authoritarian aggression. It's remarkable to see how the country has held on to its identity and values under intense military pressure. Volodymyr Zelensky, with his entertainment background, has developed a near-genius level of strategic communication. He can speak to world leaders and ordinary citizens in ways that resonate emotionally. Today, Ukraine is seen by many as the front line of a much bigger clash between democratic systems and authoritarian regimes. It's almost like the fate of global democracy is being tested on the Ukrainian plains.
But being a global symbol comes with unique challenges too, right?
Absolutely. Being a symbol brings visibility and support, but it also creates dangerous dependence. Ukraine has to constantly reinforce its alliances and justify every decision to keep getting the military and economic support it needs. That means making concessions in negotiations, accepting conditions that may not be ideal, and adapting internal policies to meet the expectations of its international partners. It's like walking a diplomatic tightrope. One misstep could mean losing critical backing. For example, we've recently seen tensions over how Allied-supplied military resources should be used. There's constant pressure to deliver tangible results and to use the gear in ways donor countries see as appropriate.
And what about future reconstruction? Do you see risks in how that's being planned?
That's one of my biggest post-war concerns. Rebuilding Ukraine will take hundreds of billions of dollars, specialized technical support, and, crucially, time and political stability. And all of that has to be managed in what could still be an unstable environment. There are real risks of corruption, which has historically been an issue in the region. Internal disputes over resource distribution. And maybe most importantly, struggles for influence among the different countries and organizations funding reconstruction. Every donor will want its interests prioritized. And then there's the fact that the most devastated areas, whole regions wiped out, will need security guarantees before people can move back in and rebuilding can even start. That makes the whole process slow and vulnerable to setbacks if instability flares up again.
So Ukraine could come out stronger, or the burden could outweigh the gains.
That's the trillion-dollar question. It hinges on two things: how the war ends, and whether international support stays strong long-term. If Ukraine preserves its territorial integrity and strengthens its democratic institutions, it could emerge as a regional power with real political weight in Eastern Europe. But if international support wanes, and we know public attention can shift, or if the war drags on endlessly, there's a real risk that internal fatigue turns into disillusionment. It's a narrow, risky path.
Sounds like Ukraine's fate is largely in the hands of its allies.
Exactly, and that shows one of modern geopolitics' biggest paradoxes. International dependence has been both Ukraine's salvation and its burden. Without NATO and other allies, Ukraine would probably have been fully occupied already. But with that dependence comes the obligation to play by outside rules and expectations. Balancing national sovereignty with international partnership is one of the toughest political challenges any nation can face, and Ukraine is doing it while fighting a defensive war. It's unprecedented in modern history.
Chris, to wrap up our conversation, let's look ahead. Based on everything we've discussed in your experience, what are the most likely scenarios in the coming months and years?
Based on the latest data and current trends, I see three big possible paths. The first would be a Russian military or economic collapse, forcing a withdrawal or an unfavorable ceasefire for Moscow. That would take a perfect storm of major battlefield defeats plus internal destabilization reaching a breaking point. The August 2025 data shows Russian forces are still managing to take ground, about 241 square miles in July, roughly the size of Chicago. That shows that militarily, despite huge costs, Russia's war machine is still functioning. The second scenario would be a forced negotiation, maybe mediated by powers like China or Turkey, leading to a frozen conflict without a real resolution. Think Korea, technically still hostile, but with relatively stable borders. And the third scenario, the one I sadly see as most likely, is a drawn-out war lasting years, with continuous destruction and neither side willing to make big concessions.
Why do you see the third scenario as the most likely?
Because both sides are trapped in narratives and commitments that make any retreat politically impossible. For Putin, admitting defeat could be fatal to his grip on power. For Ukraine, giving up territory after so much sacrifice would be betrayal to those who died defending the country. On top of that, the world is too divided for a strong diplomatic consensus. China and others are quietly backing Russia, while the West is backing Ukraine. That balance keeps the war going instead of ending it.
And how does this affect the rest of the world? We've already seen global impacts, right?
Absolutely, and they're massive. Energy prices have become national security issues for many countries. Global food security has been hit. Ukraine and Russia together used to supply a huge share of global grain exports. That directly affects countries in Africa and the Middle East that rely on those imports. But maybe the most lasting impact is the creation of new geopolitical axes. Russia's tightening its ties with China, North Korea, and Iran. It's like a new version of the axis of evil, but more sophisticated and economically integrated. On the other side, the West is being forced into unity under constant pressure, which sometimes causes tension among allies with slightly different priorities.
Do you think Western democracies are ready for this kind of long conflict?
That's one of my biggest worries. Democracies work best with quick solutions and clear consensus. They're designed to respond to public opinion, and public opinion can shift fast, especially when costs keep piling up without clear wins. This kind of drawn-out war demands something democracies struggle with: strategic patience, long-term resource commitment, and political resilience across changing governments. It's a test not just for armies, but for the values and political systems of the democratic world itself. We're already seeing signs of fatigue in some European countries, where political parties are questioning the ongoing costs of supporting Ukraine. That's natural in democracies, but it's a problem for long-term strategy.
So more than a regional war, this is really a global transformation?
No doubt. What's at stake is the global balance of power for decades to come. However, this ends will directly influence decisions by other countries considering similar moves. If Russia manages to hold on to significant territorial gains, that could encourage other authoritarian regimes to test the international system. If Ukraine restores its territorial integrity, it could deter future military adventures. Countries like China are watching closely to see how the West responds, because it'll shape their own strategy for Taiwan. Iran's studying how sanctions work in practice. North Korea's testing how far it can go in supporting Russia without direct blowback.
That really puts this on a much bigger scale than anyone imagined at the start.
Exactly. We're watching global geopolitics being reshaped in real time. The alliances being formed now, the lines being drawn, the precedents being set, all of it will shape international relations for the next 20 or 30 years. And maybe most importantly, this war is testing whether the rules-based international system set up after World War II is still viable in the 21st century. This is literally a fight over the future of world order.
Chris, this has been a fascinating and eye-opening conversation. Thank you for sharing your perspective and expertise with us.
My pleasure. I hope this discussion helps our listeners better understand the complexity of the situation and its implications for all of us. It's important to keep following these developments with critical attention and solid information.
And to those of you who've been with us until now, keep informing yourselves, keep questioning, and keep understanding how these global events shape our lives. See you on the next program.